In this lesson, we are going to be dealing with switches. So switches can be thought of as being very similar to if statements. So with an if statement, that's kind of like a fork. We have our if statement, which requires a Boolean value to dictate which path of the fork that your code takes. So if this statement is true, the script will do X. Otherwise, it will do Y. And then you can have another if statement that does the same thing. You can nest these on top of each other and basically fork your code based on true or false conditions. A switch is essentially a more efficient way of doing that when we are assigning variables a value. So what you see before you right now is essentially a blank script, except that we have some user inputs here. So we're getting an MA type, moving average type, and a moving average length. The moving average type is a string input, and it has a list of options to choose from. So if I come up to the settings menu here, we can click on this drop-down box, and here are our options. So we have 4 basic moving averages to pick from here, and then random input at the bottom. I'll show you what that's for when we start writing our switch code. And then we're getting a moving average length, which is just an integer. This is just the period length of our moving average. So first of all, let's get a moving average value using a switch with an expression. So we can use switches with or without expressions. So in this particular case, what we mean by expression is this. If I create a new variable here called moving average, this will hold our moving average value. And now if I use the switch keyword or operator, I can pass in an expression. In this particular case, our expression is just a variable value. So this could be any data type. For today's example, we are using a string, and we are going to pass in the MA type variable from our settings menu. And now what we can do is, using the equals right arrow operator, we can tell PineScript what to set moving average to based on this switch. So that looks something like this. If I say EMA, and then I write here ta.ema close, comma, MA length, what this block of code will now be doing is we'll be setting the moving average variable value to this value only if MA type equals EMA. And now we could have a whole list of switches, of options here to choose from in our switch statement. And so this is one way that we can assign a variable a value based on a list of options or types without using a whole bunch of if statements. So for example, in my library, in my Zen library, if I throw that on the chart and open up its source code, here is an example of a function that does this exact same thing. We pass in a period length and a moving average type, and then this switch will retrieve several different moving average types based on whatever we pass in as MA type into our switch. If I were to do this without a switch, I would need a separate if statement for each line of code here. So basically a switch is just a more concise version of an if statement or conditional statement. So to complete this switch, let's add in all of our moving averages. So now for SMA, we can say if MA type equals SMA, then return the ta.sma value with our MA length passed in. And I can do that for all of these. Let's just write them out first. WMA. So we have ta.rma close MA length and ta.wma close MA length. So now if MA type equals any of these values on the left here, then the switch will assign this variable the corresponding value. And now if I copy this and paste it into our plot and I save my code, we have a EMA drawing onto the chart because by default I've set the default value of MA type to EMA and I've set its default length to 50. But we can change that here. If I click SMA, the line will change. If I click RMA or WMA, that changes what type of moving average we are drawing onto the chart and referencing in our code. Now, if I select random input, we get nothing drawing onto the chart. That's the point of this random input, to show you what happens if an option that you select is not included in your switch statement. nothing will happen. We're plotting NA onto the chart because since none of these were detected, moving average was just set to NA, or basically set to nothing, a blank data type. Now, depending on what your script is doing with your switch statement, you might not want this to be possible. You might not want the user to be able to input a value into your switch that does not return something. If that's the case, we can use the default return value to trigger an error. So if none of these values are detected by this switch statement, if at the very bottom of our switch statement we put in an equals and right arrow, and we don't put in a value to the left of it, so we don't put anything on the left, we just have equals right arrow. Now whatever we put here will be the default value that gets assigned to this variable if none of these were detected in the switch. So for example, if I press enter and then tab so that we start this on a new line, we could throw an error here. So we could say, now if you're not new to programming, that might sound funny to you, but we call generating errors in our code, or at least in Java, the language that I was most proficient in before I learned PineScript. When you want to generate an error in your script to tell the user that something went wrong, it's called throwing an error. So here we can throw a runtime error using the runtime.error function, and then we can put some helpful description text in here that will tell the user what went wrong. So here I could say no matching MA type found. And then we need to return something in this default switch code. So for all of these variables here, or values, they return a float point number based on the corresponding moving average. If we get down here and none of these are found, we need to still return something. You could return anything. You could return 0.0 or any number you want, any float number, or we can just return NA. So if you just write NA at the end of this default switch returning part of our code, and now if I save the script, you can see that our script is generating an error up here. So if I change this to any of these values, we get the moving average drawing onto the chart. If I select a value that is not included in our switch, like random input, we get an error up here. And if I click on that error, we get our message here. No matching moving average type was found. So that's how switches work. You can use them with any data type. Like I said, this could be a number instead of a string. As far as I know, this can be any data type that we can work with in Pine. Now, the ones you would most likely be using is number and string types, because they are the most useful data types for this sort of use case of a switch operation. So that's how you use a switch with an expression. Let's try, let me just comment this here, draw MA. Let's try using a switch without an expression, and I'll show you what that looks like. So for this, we're going to get Boolean values using switch without an expression. For this, I'm going to keep it really simple. We're just going to detect higher close candles and lower close candles. So for a higher close, the current closing price must be greater than the previous bar's high. For a lower close, it must be less than the previous bar's low. And now we can use a switch without an expression. So see here, we use the MA type as our expression. We passed in the MA type value into our switch statement. You can also use switches without a sort of input value. And the way we do that is if I just hit enter here and then tab, here I could do something like, for example, I could say, is higher close true? If so, generate an alert, for example. Let's just do that. And I'll set our alert message to higher close detected. And the frequency can be once per bar close. And then we can start a new line here, and I can say, is lower close true? If so, we just copy this line here and change this to lower close detected. And there we have it. So now we're using a switch statement without a distinct expression. We're just switching based on these values, and whichever one returns true first will trigger this code. In this case, we'll be generating an alert. So if I save this script code and I change my moving average to a valid moving average type, and I click on create alert. Now if I select our switches script and I leave this option here selected as any alert function call, that's this alert function here. If I were to set an alert here and we got a high close candle, once that bar closed, an alert would be fired by this switch statement. And obviously the same for lower close. And we could have any number of Boolean values here that generate an expression or command for our script to execute. And as I said earlier, basically this is just a more concise version of an if statement. So we could do this exact same thing by saying if high close, fire an alert. If lower close, fire an alert. But now we have 4 lines of code instead of 3, which doesn't sound that bad. But if you had several of these conditions that you wanted to work with, for every condition you used, you would need an extra line of code for your if statement. So a switch just helps keep your code a little bit tidier when dealing with these sorts of use cases. And that's about all you need to know about switches. They take Boolean values to fire your expression or your command. If you don't pass in an expression, then the Boolean value itself is what fires the code that corresponds to it. If you do pass in an expression or a option to analyze, then based on which one of these your value matches, that will fire the corresponding code. And that's it for switches. I'll see you in the next lesson.